Good evening. Thank you. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives. We're glad you could join us tonight, whether you're here in person or watching on YouTube. And a very special welcome to those guys in white. I was a hospital corpsman, Vietnam, assigned to 1st Marines. This Saturday, September 17th, is Constitution Day, and we start the celebration with the 10th annual State of the Constitution program focusing on the future of policymaking. Our partner for tonight's program is the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier and the Millennial Action Project. Before we begin tonight and shut off the music, I'd like to tell you about two other programs that are coming up here later this month. At noon next Wednesday, September 24th, Laura Weinrib, the author of The Taming of Free Speech, America's Civil Liberties Compromise, will talk about how a surprising coalition of lawyers and activists made judicial enforcement of the Bill of Rights a defining feature of American democracy. And on Thursday, September 29th at 7:30, we'll celebrate the 150th anniversary of the passage of the 14th Amendment with a program, The 14th Amendment, the National Park Service, and America's Second Founding. Congressman James Clyburn will be the keynote speaker. To learn more about these and all of our programs, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or by email. Constitution Day, celebrated every year on September 17th, commemorates the signing of our United States Constitution 229 years ago in 1787. This special day doesn't get the attention that Independence Day gets, but it's well worth observing and is very meaningful to us here at the National Archives. Back in 1987, for the Constitution's bicentennial, we even hosted an 87-hour vigil, during which we kept the rotunda open to visitors around the clock for more than 3.5 days. Thousands came to view the Constitution even in the pre-dawn hours. This year, we're adhering to our regular museum hours, but our special exhibition, Amending America, expands our examination of the U.S. Constitution by looking at how we can change it. Starting with the Bill of Rights, we've amended the supreme law of the land only 27 times in more than 2 centuries. More startling is the fact that over 11,000 amendments have been proposed. The brilliance of the framers of the Constitution is that the document outlines a method for change and also sets a high bar for those changes. Here at the National Archives, we celebrate the Constitution every day, and we encourage all citizens to examine this founding document and consider its effects on our lives and the welfare of our nation. Now I turn the program over to Douglas Smith, Vice President for the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at Montpelier. He was named a fellow at the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership at the University of Virginia and is the former chairman of the board of HIFER International. He serves on the board of James Madison University's School of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences and Mary Washington University's Center for Honor, Leadership, and Service. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Douglas Smith.
David Ferriero, thank you so much, as always, for the Archives. Just tremendous partnership. This is our 10th annual State of the Constitution. It is a series where we have really gone deep year after year into not only what the Constitution says, interpretations of the Constitution, but maybe most importantly, how it continues to shape this country today. This evening, we have 2 panelists that will join us in just a moment to take us directly there. I want to say a couple of words. First, to those that are joining us on the web, on the live stream, feel free to tweet about the event. There's an active community of those who are watching all over the country. My name is Doug Smith, and I am at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution at James Madison's Montpelier in Orange, Virginia. It's the home of James Madison, our 4th president, and it is a wonderful estate. where we really endeavor to tell the story of both James and Dolly, and also an enslaved community that helped them and all of those that made their way to see the Sage of Montpelier. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage our two panelists. The first is Stephen Olakara. He is a political entrepreneur. He's the co-founder of the Millennial Action Project. He has an illustrious career in the NGO community and is one of the leading voices among a rising generation of Americans that are speaking about engagement and leadership among young elected officials. Please welcome Stephen Olakara. Also joining us this evening from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the Senator Rand Paul, fresh off of a national tour, not just as a political presidential candidate, but also with a book. And for those on the web, everyone in the theater today got a copy of Senator Paul's book. And so we're really thankful that he has been willing to let us put those in your hands. Senator Paul is an eye doctor from Bowling Green, Kentucky. He's originally from Texas. He and his wife, Kelly, still live in Bowling Green today. He's a graduate of Baylor and of Duke, and he is probably best known as one of the most important and leading voices that are reaching out across left and right spectrums in order to challenge people to think about the role of government and the future of this country. Please join me in welcoming Senator Rand Paul. All right, gentlemen. Well, we should probably speak about young Madisons. We should talk about young people because, Senator Paul, I think that's a population that you've really tapped into. And Stephen, I know this is a population of really significant interest to you. For both of you, what are you finding among kind of the emerging generation, a young generation of policymakers? What's really their interest and what's driving their engagement in the political square?
Well, you know, from my perspective, as I've traveled around the country, I think that you have to understand where people are to try to find out what they're interested in. So most young people don't care as much about taxes or regulations, particularly as some who own businesses, because they don't own a business, they don't have any money, and they're more concerned maybe about their own personal freedom. And so I think personal freedom, personal liberty is probably more important to young people than regulatory freedom. Now, I predict when they are in business in 10 or 15 years, they'll be upset like the rest of us that there's too much regulation and too many taxes, but it isn't really the immediate thing. If I go to a college, you know, when I went to Berkeley, I didn't really talk about, regulations and taxes. It was mostly about the Fourth Amendment and privacy, the right to be left alone.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Stephen?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to James Madison's Montpelier for partnering with the Millennial Action Project in our community to put this on. We've had an amazing turnout and amazing interest in this event. And I think one of the reasons why is because I think our generation sees an immediate need to reinvent our democracy. And we see so many interesting trends, and this is partly what I wanted to get into. So let me test the hypothesis. I'd be curious if you agree or disagree with this. Part of the reason we want to have this conversation is because I've been totally fascinated by your political career in the ways that you've disrupted party orthodoxy, the ways that you've attracted millennials to the cause of liberty, and the ways in which you've built bipartisan coalitions. And I remember when you partnered with Senator Cory Booker on criminal justice reform, it struck me that that partnership was bigger than criminal justice reform itself, but that it had larger implications. My sense is that that sort of partnership is really the future of American politics. Is you think about how millennials are coming up who are more socially progressive but fiscally conservative, see the role of entrepreneurship and free enterprise to solve problems, but also believe in science and the role of diversity. And I remember in 2012, the two candidates running for president that had the largest followings on Twitter were Barack Obama and your father, Ron Paul. And then fast forward to 2015, once all the presidential candidates announced their candidacies, the candidate with the most followers on Facebook was not Donald Trump, was not Hillary Clinton, was not Bernie Sanders, but was Rand Paul. So do you think there's something here with these sort of partnerships that you've been building with not only Cory Booker, Ron Wyden, Mark Udall, and others? And is there some sort of new consensus that's emerging that could uniquely resonate with millennials?
You know, I think the right and left come together on certain issues. So on issues of war, I'll be working with Chris Murphy next week to say that we are currently at war in Yemen. We're refueling planes that are bombing in Yemen. We're picking the targets. That sounds like we're involved in a war there, but there's been no debate in Congress.
Right.
And if Madison were here, he'd be hopping mad about it, because really the one thing they wanted to do and the one thing they were most concerned with was too much power in one place. And so Madison said, where the greatest power resides, there lies the greatest danger. And so they wanted to disperse the power. First, they didn't want the president to have too much, but then they wanted to disperse that power equally between the branches so there would be checks and balances. And I think we've gotten away from that. So Chris Murphy and I are saying next week, and we have a privileged motion that we'll get a vote, that if you're going to be at war in Yemen, you're going to have to vote to sell those arms to Saudi Arabia. And there will be a vote. We probably won't win, but we'll at least have begun the debate over whether or not it is in our best interest. People say, well, we should go to war when it's in our vital interest. Well, yeah, I agree completely, but how do we determine when it's in our vital interest unless we debate the issue?
Right.
Because what you think might be vital interest might be different from myself or Doug. But what we figured that out is by having a debate, and they didn't want to make it easy.
Right.
And they wanted to make it, people say, oh, I complain government can never do anything, Congress will never decide. Well, you know what? When we were attacked on 9/11, we were nearly unanimous to respond.
Right.
When we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, we were nearly unanimous. There have been a lot of other wars in between, much more mixed results with as far as unanimity, as far as the war goes. And maybe that's what our founding fathers wanted, is maybe not to get involved unless we were, clearly all coming together that we have to defend ourselves.
Right, right. That seems to be consistent with the data we've seen with millennials on foreign policy. But when you just see like those sort of stats about Facebook and Twitter, and I think you were the first national politician on Snapchat, I mean, why?
Yeah, I hope that's not what I'm remembered by. But,
Because that's the one takeaway of this evening is Snapchat, yeah.
yeah, and we, and my staff informed me, and so did my kids, that we weren't very cool. One of our first things on Snapchat, we put a full moon and said we were mooning our audience. And my kids are like, Dad, that's really, really bad. But we also said, don't worry, that it'll be taken down quickly, but the NSA probably got a screenshot.
Right.
It's interesting. You mentioned one of the debates you're about to have is around essentially war powers. And I think that debate's been happening in the Senate, but not in a formal way. What's helped to actually move that to the floor to a more formal debate rather than just having one senator from Virginia who's been raising the issue for several years?
Yeah, the thing with, for example, with the arms deal to Saudi Arabia, the only reason it's coming to the floor and the only reason we're talking all about it is it's a privileged motion, meaning they can't stop me. A year and a half ago, I cannot force a victory, but I can force a vote. So I will have the vote, and that's the beginning of a debate. The newspapers haven't debated the war in Yemen. Congress hasn't debated. You'd have heard almost no discussion in it. But there's a possibility Yemen turns into Syria, and that millions of people will be displaced. And where are they going to go? Saudi Arabia doesn't take them. They'll want them to come here. Saudi Arabia's in the middle of the Syrian civil war, supporting al-Nusra, which I don't think are the most pro-American group in the world. And all the displaced people in Syria, they say, oh, they're going to go to Europe or over here. And it's like, why don't they go to Saudi Arabia? It's a lot closer. And so I think we do have to discuss these issues. So we're forcing it on that. And on the use of authorization of force, whether or not the 9/11 bill that we voted to go to war or the 2002 bill that we voted to go to war in Iraq, whether they have anything to do with what we're doing now, I forced a vote on that too. There was a water bill that had been lurking around for 7 years, and so I put amendments all over it, and they couldn't deny me until they heard me. So I forced a vote in 2014 on that in the Foreign Relations Committee, but it never got to the full floor. I don't have the ability to force it on the full floor because there is no provision for a special vote. And yet, does anybody here think that the 60 words that said that we should go after those who attacked us on 9/11 have anything to do with the people with ISIS now? I mean, ISIS is now enemies with the people who attacked us on 9/11, and really the people who attacked us on 9/11 don't exist anymore. We've killed most of them, rightfully so. But the thing is that they're offshoots of an ideology. Can you kill an ideology? Can you kill everybody that adheres to an ideology? We have to look at some practicalities, but that should be the debate. We should ask ourselves, are we safer because we toppled Gaddafi? Are we safer because we toppled Hussein? Will we be safer if we topple Assad? They're all somewhat similar kind of things. Toppling a strong hand in the Middle East, does it make us safer? And that debate really should happen. And both parties have been guilty. There have been good people on both sides. Tim Kaine has tried to talk about this. Chris Murphy's tried to talk about it. I've tried to talk about it. But nobody really wants to have this debate. And it should happen. It should be the most important debate. We see young people that either in ROTC or maybe active in the military or joining the military that are here today. We owe it to them. You know, I know a young man who lost both legs and an arm, and it's like, I owe it to him. I took a pledge to defend the Constitution. There's actually a young man in the service right now who's suing. I imagine he's not real popular, but he's suing over whether or not he is lawfully obliged to go to war in the Middle East because he says he shouldn't obey an order that's not constitutional. And there has been no declaration of war, no use of authorization of force, no vote, very little discussion at all. And this isn't 9/11. There's some similarities, but this isn't 9/11. It's a new threat, different people, different country. And so, yes, we do need to have a big debate over it.
And this debate is really rising, I assume, out of a kind of a growing expectation that may be shifting. Are you seeing that the expectations of government are evolving and shifting, particularly among younger people? Because that's where you've really tapped into a lot of energy.
Maybe. I think there have not been enough people yet to understand that their expectations for the federal government should be close to zero. So when you talk to the young people about education, or if I'm out on a panel like this in Silicon Valley talking to some of the innovators over there, how are we going to fix education? I say, do not look to Washington. Absolutely don't look up here. They have no clue. They can't run the post office. Government's too big. We borrow $1 million every minute. There will never be a valid idea. If it is, it's an accident that comes out of Washington. But there are a lot of things that we could do in our schools today. I'm a big fan of the idea of extraordinary teacher program. Why wouldn't we have the 1,000 best teachers be like the NFL? Why wouldn't we pay them a lot more? Why wouldn't we reward them in an extraordinary way? And why wouldn't they teach almost all the pupils? So instead of having 15 classes, 15 kids in a classroom, I think we ought to have 15 million in a classroom, virtual classroom. You'd still have teachers, but why wouldn't the best explainer of calculus explain maybe one chapter and the best explainer of the second chapter in the whole world explain it to everyone? And we've seen some of this. If you look at like Sal Khan online, he's just a great explainer. He doesn't have a teaching degree, but he's an incredible explainer. Look up the Doppler effect on there, and even if you weren't in science, you're like, oh my goodness, I finally understand how the Doppler effect works. And but that kind of stuff should be, that's the beauty of the internet, and we're not using the internet. We give people smartphones and expect them to be smart, but really the smartness of a phone is being connected to someone who has knowledge that you can absorb.
That's interesting. You mentioned that we should reduce our expectations for the federal government. Do you think there's any link between our disillusionment with government and the dysfunction that we're seeing in Congress and the reduction of our expectations? I mean, it seems to be self-explanatory that if you think an institution doesn't work well, you think there should be less of it in your lives. But I think we want our federal government to be functional, even if we want our expectations for it to be less. I mean, how do you kind of reconcile those two?
I tell people there are two reasons why you want your government to be small, or why you want minimal or limited government. The first reason is the liberty argument. You have to give up some liberty. So we have this social compact, and we decide to have a government. And most of us think, yeah, well, you need some government to defend the country, for law and order, for maybe a few other things. But you need some government. And so you have to give up some liberty. And where do you see your liberty given up? You see it on your paycheck. Right. A portion of your paycheck goes to the government, taxation. But we wouldn't want it to be 100% of our paycheck, then we'd have zero liberty. So we're at about 50-50. Do you want to be 50% free, 50% enslaved by the system? But really you'd want to be, the number should be the lowest you can possibly have and still have government what you need. And that should be the debate. How do we have the smallest government we can possibly have and still have the maximum amount of liberty you have and do the things we need to do? And that should be the debate up here, but that really isn't the debate up here. But then the second reason why you want government to be small is what I call the efficiency argument. And this is what Milton Friedman put forward when he said, nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. You think about it. If it's your $1,000 I'm asking you for, you're going to think long and hard. I had to work to earn $2,000 to have $1,000, and my labor went into that. So you think about your decision to give me $1,000. Ask a politician for 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,billion, and it's no thought at all. And they just don't make wise decisions because it's not their own, and so we should limit their decisions.
Yep.
We will have to have a national defense. We do. It's something you can't do individually. And there are a few other limited items that Madison would have said are few and defined, you know, and in Federalist 45 he says few and defined. The powers are limited that were given to government. Government's not supposed to do everything and not supposed to be everything to everyone.
Yeah. Another one of the Federalist papers in 10, he talks about breaking and controlling the violence of faction. How do we, again, it goes back to this institutional effectiveness question. How do we make the institution work such that no narrow faction, you know, dominates over the others?
You know, I think that's a harder question. I think in some ways they might have been overly optimistic about not having faction because it occurred pretty early.
Right.
You know, if you look at the vitriol between Adams and Jefferson early on, you know, the accusations of illegitimate children and affairs and adultery and duels. I mean, it was going on from the very beginning, so it wasn't like we ever had this glory time, you know, golden age with no faction. I do think, though, that if government is small, because I think the extension to this is campaign finance reform.
Exactly.
People say, well, we need to control finances because money's corrupting the system. Well, make government so small we can barely see it, have it do very little other than the national defense, and maybe nobody will want to buy it. You know, if government's very limited, you don't want to buy it. If government's in every nook and cranny of your life, you got to buy it just to protect yourself.
Right.
So businesses are buying into electing politicians because they have to protect themselves from government. Other people are buying into it because they want to control business. But ultimately, campaign finance reform, the only way to probably make it constitutional, and I've explored this with some Democrats, is that if you limited corporations that receive money from government. And I think if you did that, and the unions that work for them, business and unions, anybody has a contract with the federal government, you write into the contract that you are limited in what you can give to politicians if you're going to take this large contract from the government.
Right.
I think that would be constitutional because it's a contract. It's a voluntary thing. You either take it or you don't. I think that's how you could get campaign finance reform, but it would require the left acknowledging they're going to have unions come under campaign finance reform, and the right would have to acknowledge that contractors of all sorts, shapes, and sizes will be under the rules as well. And it is one of the egregious things that people appear to be getting money from government, taking that money and coming back and lobbying against, you know, with our own taxpayer money, lobbying for more taxpayer money.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that in the book, The Revolving Door between D.C. and Wall Street, too. And I think you actually had a quote in your book from Bernie Sanders. And I think that is actually an interesting left-right coalition that's building around that. I was wondering if you could speak more to what can we do to end that revolving door and that cycle of corruption.
There, I think there should be rules on, you know, we have a rule saying you can't go from Congress, you have to wait a year to be a lobbyist. Well, these guys are slick. They just don't become lobbyists. They
Right.
become the friend that takes everyone to lunch who doesn't lobby.
Right.
And they do that immediately.
That's exactly
And
right. Yeah.
and then some of them never become lobbyists. They just take people to lunch and they supposedly don't do any lobbying.
Right.
I think there could be some restrictions. I think there ought to also be restrictions on presidents, frankly. I think the Clintons have corrupted the system, and that if you're going to take hundreds of millions of dollars, the taxpayer shouldn't pay for your security. I think the Clintons should have security. Bill Clinton should. He's an ex-president. He should have security. But if he made $200 million, should we be paying for it?
Right.
You know, if you want to be president and you're going to be like Harry Truman, and you're just going to go back to the barber shop or whatever, the hat shop, maybe we should provide everything. But if you're going to go make $200 million speaking to foreign countries, maybe you ought to pay for your own security.
Right.
Senator, you've mentioned several times partnerships, a lot of left-right partnerships, and I'm wondering how, because that's just not what the general public sees. They're not seeing much function. I would think that a lot of young Madisons, people who really ascribe to what the Constitution means, and they're young people even thinking about moving into political office or getting engaged civically, all they hear is people bemoaning the system being broken. But what
Right.
you're suggesting is that, in fact, there is some compromise, or maybe it's better to say collaboration happening between parties. Why aren't we seeing more of that?
I think that it's misrepresented by the press. I think the press misrepresents that we're at each other's throats and it's nothing but angry vitriol up here. And it's actually the opposite. I've seen more angry within the party, Republican on Republican anger or Democrat on Democrat anger, than I've actually seen between the parties. So, for example, I've worked with Cory Booker on criminal justice. We have a great relationship, and He suggested things that I've gone along with that I didn't think about before he suggested them. Ron Wyden on privacy and that the NSA should obey the Fourth Amendment and that we shouldn't have bulk collection of all our records. Ron Wyden and I, we laughingly call ourselves the Bill of Rights Coalition, or caucus.
Caucus
It's a small caucus.
Yeah, it is. Unfortunately, it is. Chris Murphy, we're working together on some of the arms things. Bernie Sanders, I worked with on auditing the Fed. And I think there are people, to me, I am a Republican, I'm a partisan, and I will probably continue to be partisan.
I felt just a little
A little bit of that. But at the same time, I really don't care what party you're in. And in fact, I think the biggest problem we face as a republic is too much power has gravitated to the presidency, and we've had a collapse of the separation of powers. So instead of 1-to-1 presidency to Congress, I think it's 1,000-to-1, that the presidency is 1,000-fold stronger than Congress. And some of that, getting that back, will require alliances where if there was a Republican president, I'd be exactly the same thing. And so if this were a Republican president now, I'd be badgering him on the arms to Saudi Arabia and no military authorization from Congress.
Well, how do you respond to those who say that the reason the executive has gotten so energetic and so powerful is because Congress isn't seemingly able to act? And so the president just steps in, feels much more nimble, and will just let the courts handle it.
Right.
Later.
But maybe we're divided and we aren't certain of what we want. So let's take immigration, for instance. I didn't vote for the bill, but I agreed with about half of it. And so if you'd given me half of it, a little bit less of the whole bill, I could have voted for it. So we didn't end up getting it passed. But immigration reform could pass. Let's say there's 10 items. And we take everybody in this group and we ask them about what do you want to do with immigration with 10 different items. We'd probably find 4 or 5 that almost everybody could agree on. Maybe 90% of us could agree on. Why don't we take the contentious ones and put them aside and pass the things we agree on? And there's a little bit of this problem in both parties. They want everything their way or nothing. So there are people in the Senate who will not take any immigration reform unless it's everything. And by everything, the sticking point is voting if you came here illegally, or how quickly that occurs, or whether it occurs. But whether or not we might have more migrant workers, more skilled workers, more EB-5 workers, people who bring money in and start businesses in our community, there's a lot of agreement on a lot of other issues.
I'm curious, so immigration is an example, I think, the bill you're referring to, of compromise, and Madison talked a lot about compromise. What I was interested in, criminal justice reform with Booker and privacy with Wyden and those sort of examples, is it seems like it's a different kind of bipartisanship, and I wonder if you agree with that. It seems like it's not a compromising of the ideals, but sort of coming to the same result for different reasons. Is there a difference there?
Yeah, and I think
okay.
I think you're exactly right. We're not being blocked by partisanship. So I work with Ron Wyden because I don't let partisanship blind me that I can work with him. But as far as compromise, we agree pretty much on NSA, that the NSA's got too much power and that we're not obeying the Fourth Amendment, and that if you give information, whether it's metadata or otherwise, to your phone company, you still have a privacy right in that. And that the Fourth Amendment intended, originally they didn't want British soldiers to come into our house to take our papers because of the Stamp Act. Mm-hmm. But we don't have any papers in our house anymore. I don't want them in my cloud. There's a lot of stuff in the cloud. There's more stuff in the cloud than you could have ever imagined in your house. In fact, if you ask somebody snooping on your behavior, do they want to come to your house? They don't care about your house. They want to get on your computer. They want to see what you've got in the cloud. They want to see what you search. And I'm all for that if it's individualized and we have suspicion. That's the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah.
The Fourth Amendment says we can't look at everybody's records, but we can look at specific people. And I don't care how deep you go. The Boston bombers, I think we should have looked at their records before the bombing. We had probable cause. The Russians had tipped us off. But I don't think we should have looked at everybody in Boston's records.
That's right.
So I don't think we should all give up on our privacy in order to, maybe stop or maybe aid in security in this, because I think most of the evidence doesn't show that we have gained in security.
Yeah, that's interesting. After the Boston bombing, millennials were the only demographic that did not want to give up their civil liberties in favor of security. So that message is a very, I think, millennial message. And I like those examples of partnerships. Are there any other opportunities you see, like criminal justice reform, like surveillance and privacy? Is there anything else that fits into that?
I think war.
Yeah.
And then I think also, there are a host of others, but I think war, privacy, foreign policy in general, and then audit the Fed.
Right.
The fact that there may be too much power involved in one location, and whether or not it needs to be dispersed back. And some of it's because presidents have grabbed the power, but some of it's because Congress has given it up. So it's
Yeah.
a two-way street. Presidents, they get, President Obama said he was annoyed. He had his pen and his phone, he would do what he wanted because we weren't doing it. But democracy's messy. I mean, our founding fathers knew that, and you have to get consensus. And consensus is presenting something to you where there's 1,000 moving pieces, and we whittle it down to get rid of the most emotional stuff that we disagree on until we get to a bulk of things we agree on. And that we could do more of. And that's what I would call the definition of compromise,
Right.
is figuring out your common ground. But one of the frustrations in Washington is we don't get there because it's all or nothing.
Right.
You either get all of immigration reform or none.
That's right.
Because I've been working on the specific issue of migrant workers. My farmers say they need migrant workers in our state, but the system doesn't work very well. So I have just these little technical changes to have either multi-year visas or make the visas easier for people who've been coming for years to work. And I can't get them through because nobody wants to listen to it. They say, oh, we'll do it when we do overall immigration reform.
Right.
Same with tax reform, too. There's a lot of
Yep.
things that can be fixed in the tax code, but it's either all or none, whereas I would try to pick off the areas where we agree.
Yeah, yeah. So we've been hearing a lot of interest about criminal justice reform, and we've referenced the REDEEM Act, your bill with Cory Booker. Maybe you can just give like a quick overview of, you've sponsored a lot of bills on this topic, but kind of what's happening on that topic, and why are you getting Democrats and Republicans to come together on criminal justice?
I think when you look at our criminal justice system, there are a couple things that are going on. I think we have over-criminalized at the federal level almost everything, from drugs to white-collar crime to campaign finance, really. We're putting people in jail for not filling out the forms correctly on campaign finance. I don't believe that people really understood that with McCain-Feingold, we would put people in jail for filling out the forms wrong.
Yeah.
That's a little bit too far. But the other thing we've found with the war on drugs is that there's a racial disparity. 3 out of 4 people in prison are black or brown, but the black population is like 12%. How did that happen? And if you look at drug use surveys, drug use between blacks and whites is about the same. How did we get a prison population full of African Americans? And I don't think it's so much overt racism, but it is a problem. There is a racial disparity in the war on drugs, and we ought to try to fix it. One way to fix it is, I think, not to have penalties for some of the stuff that involves jail time. If it's a misdemeanor or a lot of things that are nonviolent, they should be misdemeanors. So downgrade some drug crimes to misdemeanors. We can still say don't do it and that there should be a penalty, but then let people expunge their records over time. In Kentucky, we have a Republican governor, and he just passed expungement bill. After a certain period of time, you get your record erased, because we should all want people to get back to work. And many of us, for religious reasons, believe that there is something called redemption and that most people are redeemable and can get a second chance. And most of us who were kids did occasionally themselves, do something they probably shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
And
Anyone here? Okay.
yeah, nobody here probably. I think this is a pretty straight-laced crowd. But, the difference is if you are poor and you do something wrong, the police will be there.
That's right.
And I think it's important that we not blame all of it on racism either, because frankly, many of the police in our inner cities are African American. They're not doing it because they are racist. They're doing it because there's more crime when there's more poverty, when people live closer together. That doesn't mean we shouldn't address it. We should try to figure it out, but it's not, and there are bad people who are racist, but it's not really, it's more complicated than that. It has to do with sort of this idea of zero tolerance, but if there's a white kid in the suburbs smoking pot in his parents' basement, he never gets caught because the police aren't ever going there.
That's right.
But it adds up day after day after day, and it's a cycle of poverty to incarceration, back to poverty to selling drugs with a hopelessness. And the republic only continues as long as people have hope. If we have people lose so much hope that they are just ready to chuck it all, that's a real problem, and the system will break down. So people have to have hope, and I still think it's a great country. I mean, it is. We are the richest, greatest, freest country on the planet, but we do have some problems, and we ought to try to fix them.
Right. And a lot of that's in the REDEEM Act, I think, right? Okay.
Expungement is, and then the other thing that Cory convinced me on was, or informed me on, was sort of the solitary confinement.
Right.
And then I read the story of Khalif Browder, that really affected me. And this was a 16-year-old black kid in the Bronx, arrested and accused of a crime, put in Rikers Island, and kept for 3 years without a trial. Wow. He was beaten by gangs in prison, beaten by guards in prison, tried to commit suicide. and then sadly finally got out and they never had a trial. They just said, oh, whoops, we should have tried you or done something, but we forgot. And meanwhile, he was a scarred teenager, was in solitary confinement for 2 out of 3 years, and then when he got out, did successfully commit suicide. And I think that that shouldn't happen in our country, holding someone for 3 years without a trial. And frankly, it wouldn't happen to a rich white kid. Your dad's rich and you get a lawyer, you're not going to spend 3 years in Rikers Island. He did have actually a probation, an offer to pay, but he couldn't pay.
Right.
Yeah, it's a dreadful story, isn't it? So you have these passions, you have these issues, you've got partnerships that you are helping to forge and you're part of. What is the partnership that you next want to start, and who in the Senate would you like to join you?
Well, I think it's ongoing right now with the arms sales. In June of this year, Chris Murphy and I got together to try to block subsidized sale of F-16s to Pakistan. And we were unsuccessful, but interestingly, other people got involved behind the scenes and were trying to hold back the money to buy the planes to give to them, and as if we have a surplus somewhere to buy weapons with. And so it got blocked, and actually, I think our battle indirectly helped stop it because it didn't happen. The latest sale is $1 billion worth of tanks and other weapons to the Saudis, but we have sold in the last 8 years $100 billion to Saudi Arabia. And someone should have a debate. Are we going to be safer if Saudi Arabia topples or defeats the Houthi rebels? Now, the Houthi rebels are backed by Iran, who are also not our friends, but Al-Qaeda is also pretty strong in Yemen, and so as Saudi Arabia is fighting the Houthi rebels, Al-Qaeda is over here organizing. Sounds suspiciously like Syria, where we wanted to topple Assad. We supported these moderates, and there was this third group, or actually in Syria, there were 1,500 groups. And one of them grew very strong, and that was ISIS. In the midst of chaos, but in the midst of us pushing back on Assad, there was more room for ISIS to grow. And it's people say, oh, you're blaming us for doing it. No, ISIS is to blame, but ultimately we need to look at things we do to try to not repeat the unintended consequences.
Yeah, I feel the tension there and in a second we're going to go to some questions on the sides. And so let me just say that if you'd like to ask a question of the panel, feel free to go to one of the microphones on each side, and we'd be happy to call on you. I do feel this tension about your comments earlier about smaller government, and at the same time, we know that we have these very global problems. As a senator, how difficult is it to reconcile those and prioritize those? Because I can imagine that that's a real tension when it comes to national security.
Well, see, I think one of the mistakes is historically people have tried to characterize my position as being, isolationist. But it's actually the opposite. I want more engagement with the world. So, for example, in the presidential debate, all the other candidates were saying we need to punch Russia in the nose. We need to have a no-fly zone, and even if it means shooting down Russian planes. And it's like, have you read any of our history? Did you hear about the Cold War, where we valiantly tried and successfully went through 70 years without having to fight the Russians? And so I think that we need to engage the Russians. The solution in Syria will inevitably, if there is a solution, involve the Russians. Doesn't mean I'm an apologist for Putin or look the other way that he commits human rights violations in Russia, but at the same time, they've had a base in Syria for 40 or 50 years. They're not just going to get up and leave. And so they are there, they're bombing. Let's try to convince them to work together, to eradicate what we see as a common enemy, ISIS. But it's complicated. I mean, the Turks would rather shoot the Kurds than they would ISIS. Most of the Syrian bloc of rebels would rather shoot Assad than they would ISIS. And ISIS doesn't like Assad either. So, I mean, it's a very, very confusing situation, but that's why it ought to be debated by the American public, because I see it in very personal terms. It's going to be a young man or woman who loses an arm or a leg or loses their life. It's our job and our responsibility to debate that. If we don't debate that, we shouldn't be here. They should all just go home. If they're not willing to debate whether we're at war or not, they should just relinquish their office.
Great. Let's take a couple of questions. Why don't we start here? Please state your name, and we would ask that you keep your questions fairly short and to one question. sometimes we get a laundry list and we kind of lose track of which question you might be asking. So,
Hi, my name is Andrew. Thank you so much, Senator Paul, for coming today and for the other panelists as well. I wanted to ask a question, this question just because it hasn't really been addressed by many politicians, but what are your thoughts on the DMCA and how, because I know that on YouTube there are some concerns of the potential for violations of fair use. So I was wondering how, as I guess constitutionalists, we should consider the DMCA. Should we consider reforming it, or is that like an area that we shouldn't be involved in, or?
You're going to have to help me with the acronym. You said DMCA?
DMCA. It's the Digital Millennial Copyright Act. Basically, so.
I thought we made an arrangement, no copyright
no
or patent,
copyright.
but I'm just kidding. It's a complicated issue, and I don't think I can give you the best answer on it. I do think that I can give you more of an overview of sort of intellectual property, that intellectual property is very important to our country, and a great deal of not only wealth, but innovation comes from intellectual property. So I am for that, but it is a double-edged sword in a lot of things, and this isn't necessarily copyright, but patent. You've seen in the news the EpiPens costing $600, and you're like, oh, capitalism is terrible. Now we just need price controls. Well, no, it isn't capitalism. It's a broken marketplace because we have prevention of entry by the government. So we do need to look at those things. And on copyright's a different issue because I don't think if you copyright your book or something, there's a real danger you're going to have a monopoly on your book.
Or in the instance of YouTube videos, if you review like a movie or something, then.
Yeah, I don't know. And some of it, I think also the marketplace works out too. I mean, YouTube's very, very aggressive at making you take down stuff, and they are doing that to try to protect the artists. But do they go too far sometimes? Yeah, I mean, I had permission from an artist to use a video, but I didn't realize that he actually told me personally I could use it, but he didn't own the whole video. Somebody else had. It was complicated who owned the rights. Other people that were in the video had right of refusal, and he didn't know it either. So it is confusing sometimes who has copyright. But is copyright in general important? Yes, and copyright I think is easier than patent actually, because copyright lasts a long time, and it's usually an intellectual property. And I guess if it's something you don't really copyright things like software programs. Those are patents.
Yeah.
So it's really a different issue, and I think there's probably less controversy in copyright than there is in patents.
yeah, the good news is, you have someone like Michelle Lee, who's amazingly strong, comes out of Silicon Valley, is running the USPTO. They know that these are evolving and emerging issues, and I think the companies really are trying to work together to work through these, and we know there'll always be, some overstepping and then some reconciling back and forth.
But EpiPen will have been patented with a monopoly for 38 years. They got it in 1987. It was actually invented in the 70s. So they get a patent in 1987 because they probably had to wait 10 years to get a patent, and they've had it, and it's not going to expire until 2025 because they can modify the patent and extend their rule. And if anybody wants to make a generic, it's an automatic 30-month delay while it goes to court. All you have to do is sue. You don't have to have any evidence that someone was treading on your patent. You just sue everybody that comes to the market, and it's another 30 months. So we need to do something about that. I mean, tetracycline for kids' acne, $1,200 for a month, and it's a 50-year-old antibiotic that's generic, and it's costing $1,200 for a month's worth of acne medicine. Something's wrong with that, but it's not capitalism. It's government interference in the market.
I'm feeling that you're being a doctor coming out there, but it is fair to say that it wasn't much of a debate, but at the Constitutional Convention, they actually talked about, and it made its way into the Constitution, the idea of protecting people's intellectual property. And so this is something that, thank you for your question, it's something the country's really been honoring and at times had tension around from the very, very beginning. Next question.
Thank you.
My name is Charlie Crocker. I just wanted to thank you for being here, Senator. You mentioned that young people like myself shouldn't be expecting much from government. So with that, I ask you, why should we expect anything from you, and why would you be using a seat in Congress and a pursuit of the highest office in the land to lead that change to create a functional government?
Right. And I may say that too flippantly because I don't want to give you that expectation that government doesn't do anything. But government's most important in protecting your rights. Your right to freedom of speech. So every day I defend your right to freedom of speech. Every day I defend your right to be left alone. Every day I defend your right to be equally protected under the law, no matter who you are, or where you came from, or anything about you. You should be treated fairly under the law. So it's not that we do nothing. But if you're looking for sort of a material change that isn't sort of the defense of your liberty. If you're looking for government to efficiently create good education, there's a large body of evidence that they're not very good at it. And I'm not saying abolish the public schools. I went to public schools. Some are good. Some are really, really rotten. We should try to fix some of the rotten ones. We should allow for more competition. But so, for example, I think I go into towns and there'll be Mitsubishi there or Toyota there, and the first thing they tell me is we can't get enough people that even have basic math coming out of the high school. So they're going into the high schools and trying to fix the high schools, and I think that's good. And I think local input is good, and some of the certain skills that they want in that factory, they're trying to get those taught in the high school. I just wouldn't wait for the top-down approach. Doesn't mean it can't be fixed. It might even involve government, but at a more local level. I think government's just too big here to be efficient. The other problem we have is if you ask me to fix something, I'm going to say, with what? I mean, we borrow $1 million a minute. So am I really fixing the problem if we're $20 trillion in the hole? And I say, oh, yep, I'm going to fix your problem. So that's really the problem of Washington in a nutshell. Everybody comes up here and wants to fix something, and they want more money for it. And a lot of them are good causes. I mean, I look and say, that's a great cause. And I say, what should I cut to pay for it? You know, and there is money. I mean, we could decide not to have another $1 trillion war in the Middle East, and there's $1 trillion right there. So we're a rich country. Look, we bring in $3 trillion in tax revenue. We can try to do things, but I would still send it mostly back to the states. I would devolve things to the states because they have limits on how much they can spend. They don't have a printing press. They don't have a Federal Reserve. So there are limits. They have to obey limits. And the one thing about obeying limits is you have to prioritize your spending. If you have unlimited spending, you're spending on everything. But if you only have $100, you have to prioritize where you spend your $100. So the money's more wisely spent in your state on education than up here because there are limits to how much they can spend. They're closer to the classroom. What works in Appalachia may not be the same as what works in Los Angeles as far as education.
Great, thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Senator Paul. My name is Michael, and I'm a student at Hillsdale College. Tonight you spoke with eloquence, I think, about the need for Congress to assert their proper constitutional authority as regards the presidency. What do you think that Congress and perhaps even the president can do to assert their authority regarding the Supreme Court?
You know, there are checks and balances there, and actually you're seeing a significant check right now on the power of the presidency there, and some would argue that, you know, we've gone too far. But I would also argue that there's a great crisis in our country between the separation of powers, and that some of the debates in the Supreme Court right now are to decide where does the power lie. Does the president have the power to write immigration law without any congressional authority? Immigration law that changes the law for millions of people. His law, arguably, but I think by whether you're for it or against it, changes the law for millions of people. Can he do that on his own? I don't even think it matters whether you agree or disagree with what he's doing. Should a president have the right to write the laws? You know, one of the things that Montesquieu said is he said when the executive begins to write the laws, that's when a type of tyranny will ensue. And so the danger is, and it isn't even this president that we worry about him, it's the next president and the next president who thinks they can unilaterally act. But those decisions are before the Supreme Court now, so it's very important, you know, what happens. And we have an evenly divided Supreme Court, the same way we got an evenly divided society. But you're seeing some check and balance right now, and I don't know what happens, you know, after the election. Depends on who wins. But I think ultimately, if there is a Democrat winning, they will get their nominee. But there'll be some significant debate on the advice and consent that the Senate has to give to the nominee.
You know, it's an important question about the courts. So many issues. I mean, everything from Obamacare and I mean, they're all making their way to the courts. This constant march of social and political issues making their way to the courts, have the courts become too powerful because they are now the last arbiter?
Interestingly, I actually take the opposite approach. And a lot of conservatives think, oh, the Supreme Court's too powerful and they're doing too much, they're too active and they need to be more restrained.
Except when they agree with them.
Yeah, and here's a good point. And here's a good point. Obamacare passed because Justice Roberts voted, and in his conclusion said that if we can imagine a law constitutional, we must imagine it so and leave it alone. The presumption of constitutionality is this idea of judicial restraint, not that the justices should come in and overturn that they should be very reticent to do so. I think they've been so reticent that we went from like 1937 to 1997 without ever overturning anything. So I'm kind of a fan of Randy Barnett, who teaches at Georgetown Law, and he's written several books on a sort of this philosophy of judicial engagement, that really there should be a presumption of liberty, that the individual has liberty and the job of government is to protect that liberty, but we shouldn't presume the government's always right. The government can only be right when it agrees with the enumerated powers of the Constitution. If the government tries to do something beyond the enumerated powers, then there should be a presumption of my liberty, and the law should be struck down. And under that philosophy, you'd actually have more laws struck down than you have now. And really, since the Great Depression, you've had very few laws struck down.
One of the big questions in front of the court recently had to do with the president's authority around the EPA regulations.
Right.
And I think the president actually agreed with you around the Congress should legislate around the environment and around climate change. You have a whole chapter in your book entitled Tree Hugger, so you are an environmentalist. What if the Congress actually did do something and the courts didn't have to litigate it? What should Congress do around pollution and climate change?
You know, I think there are common areas, or what economists call externalities, that nobody quite owns them or everybody owns them, and there is a role for government in those. Right. And we have regulated in those areas. But with the recent regulations, which I'm very involved with, are regulations on the coal industry, which is very big in my state. Right. President Obama has written regulations that are thousands of pages long that appear to be law. And so even if I were, thinking he should do all of that, if I were doing my job as a justice, I'd strike it down. Right. They did vote 5-4 right before Scalia died to put a stay on those new regulations that he's put out. And really, it's just democracy's messy. He needs to come to the Capitol Hill and try to convince us. Yeah. And he has on occasion, but I don't think he's done enough of that. And I mean, when there's a description of whether the president's been engaged enough or too aloof, I don't think he's tried very hard with us. I'm one who will work with him. I'm one who will compliment him when he gives a commutation of a sentence on somebody who has a nonviolent crime and has been in jail for 20 years. Right. I am for allowing those people to try to have another life again, if it's particularly for nonviolent crimes. Yeah.
So you do see some prospects for common ground on the environment?
Yeah, but I think he gave up long ago on us.
Yeah.
I mean, he just pretty much does what he wants. Yeah. And now we have a court that's in the middle of it, and we have a 4-4 court, so we're not really getting anywhere. Yeah. And so that's why it hangs in the balance of the election, right. Who will control the Supreme Court, not just for a year or two, but maybe who controls the Supreme Court for several decades.
Right, right.
Let's just take 2 more questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you for speaking, Senator Paul. My name is Ellie Narrigan, and I'm wondering if there are any new constitutional amendments that you'd like to see us adopt, and if you have any thoughts about the Article 5 Convention of States proposal.
Okay. Yeah. Balanced budget amendment. I ran on that and will run for re-election on that. I don't think getting back to sort of disgust with the system, it's one of the things I think Congress should do but can't do, and they should balance their budget, and we should only spend what comes in, but we don't ever do it. So I think we actually need external pressure through a balanced budget amendment. I'm also for term limits. I think there's no monopoly of knowledge in Washington. I've met most of these people, and no monopoly of knowledge. Article 5 of the Constitution allows for constitutional amendments to be also presented by convention. We've never had that. Some people fear it. And some people say, well, they might have it, they might rewrite the Constitution. And I say, well, what do you mean, the one they completely ignore now? So I'm kind of not opposed to the Article 5. My prediction is, if you had an Article 5 Constitution, that legislators in state legislatures would try to significantly restrict what they can vote on, and they wouldn't approve it if you went and did something else. So if you went and gave us the French Constitution, you came back, I'm guessing the state legislatures would be a check on that. I can't imagine that they wouldn't. But I also predict this, that the moment there actually was a date set and enough state legislators voted to have a constitutional convention, I think Congress would get off their duffs and do the right thing and vote for the amendment.
I'm a big fan of term limits as well, because it's had a big impact on younger legislators getting leadership positions, especially at the state level.
So you're trying to get rid of us so there'll be a
That's because he
Yes.
wants your job.
Absolutely. But so we try and combat.
You know you have to move to Kentucky.
Yes. But we try and combat the arguments against. I'm curious how you would combat the issue around institutional knowledge. People say, you need people there for a long time because they learn how the institution works and then they can start working on things. It seems to me that you can have staff that stays along for a while and they can help out with that. But how do you respond to those critiques?
I think there are some valid arguments against.
Yeah.
The first argument I would make against, even though I'm a co-sponsor of the amendment, but the first argument I would make against is the president's already so powerful that if the president's 1,000-fold more powerful, would you not weaken Congress some by not having people there long enough to gain the stature to try to stand up to the president? So that's one reason I might not. The other thing with staff, while I love my staff, and some of them are here, is that staff could become a problem too. If they're there 20 and 30 years and they have actually more power than the elected officials. There are some officials, we won't name names, whose staff has grown too powerful and the members no longer really paying attention to what's going on and the staff's running the whole thing.
Right.
And that can be a problem, not because they are intent on doing the wrong thing, but they don't get elected, so they're not as responsive to the people. It has worked kind of in the states, though. States have had term limits, and I think it's worked. I think having a little bit, one of the amendments now is 6 years in the House, and I've supported it just because I'm in support of the concept, but I actually think 12 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, make it equal for both. And actually, if you serve 12 years in the House and then want to run for the Senate, 12 more, which should be more than enough time.
Yeah.
And, but I don't know. I think having an in-between, 6 years might be too short to really maybe gain the institutional knowledge.
Right.
But our founding fathers wanted government to be a lot smaller. They wanted us to be home harvesting our crops or, any more typing code or whatever we do when we go home. I think what we should do is pay congressmen half as much, have them here half as long, and require that they work. It's the opposite now.
Right.
We forbid congressmen from working.
Right.
All these rules to forbid congressmen from working. We keep them up here all the time, and they get more disconnected from their, from their communities.
Yeah. And they spend so much time fundraising, too. Do you wish you could spend less time fundraising?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have some supporters here, and they agree with me.
Yeah.
Dialing for dollars. All right, last question.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. My name is Sean Tima. I'm currently the Midwest Regional Director with Young Americans for Liberty. When upheld, the Constitution protects us from unreasonable search and seizure. And I'm interested to hear your perspective on the state of civil asset forfeiture in the United States, as well as if you could offer any insights on developments for reform within Congress currently.
Right. The big debate, to my mind, on the Fourth Amendment is whether or not it should be individualized or generalized. And then the second part of that debate, though, is what does it protect? And so many of the people say, and they'll say this explicitly, if you listen to them, the people for bulk collection of all of your phone metadata, they say it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the phone company, and they're writing a single warrant to a single company for all of your information, but you have no interest in it. In Maryland versus Smith in 1979, they kind of said this, and I think they were wrong. It was 6-3. Thurgood Marshall voted in the minority, but voted, I think, correctly that you do have a right to privacy in some of this data. In the 1920s, they voted that your conversation on the phone was not protected. So from 1928 to 1968, your conversation wasn't protected. But one of the amazing things, and it amazes me every day, is we live in such a civilized world that we can be wrong for 40 years and then change our mind. Plessy versus Ferguson said that people were separate but equal in 1898 or 1895, and they were wrong. But it took 50 some odd years to 1954 to get to Brown versus the board where we finally figured out we were wrong. I'm hoping that happens with our data because it's changed. You all know how much data you have on your phone or in a cloud somewhere, and I think most of you think it's yours, that it's private. And that if I accuse you of a crime and I get a warrant from a judge, somebody will look at it. So you can't be a criminal. You can't be, stealing stuff and then selling it online on your phone and expect, if I have evidence, that I'm not going to look at it. But if you're, God forbid, reading imprimis from Hillsdale College, should that be something the government should look at you because you're suspicious and you believe in capitalism and liberty? No, I think you should be protected unless there's suspicion, probable cause, but whether that applies to third-party records is the big part of the debate. The people who don't believe in privacy say, no, it only is papers in your house. It's not the cloud, and it's not the phone company. It's only your house. And I think that technology has rendered that opinion incorrect.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the questions. These are excellent questions, and probably some of the best we've had in the last 10 years. And in closing, there is a little bit of an elephant in the room, and I don't say that because you're a Republican. And it is about the national election. So I just want to ask both of you, what do you think the most important issue? The candidates, but issue. What's the most important issue facing the country in this national election cycle? And maybe we start with you, Stephen, and we'll let you close it up, Senator.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a real honor to be up here on stage with both of you, and I'm thankful for the entire Millennial Action Project community for coming out, our staff. I know Matt Kibbe is out here somewhere. Thank you for all of your help with this event. It's been a real pleasure. It seems to me that one of the biggest issues that we have to confront that isn't really being talked about is the issue of civic engagement. Two of the statistics that are really troubling to me and prompted us to start this whole effort is that a majority of millennials don't believe politics can solve the problems we face, and less than a third of us don't see public service as an appealing career track. And you think about the framers 229 years ago who came together, and I think they wanted talented people, young people in particular, to be running for office and to be getting actively involved. I mean, the founders themselves were millennial aged. So it seems like we need more discussion around that, because when congressional approval ratings go down to, say, 9% during the government shutdown, it doesn't seem like that's sustainable for democracy. I'd be curious your thoughts on that. But I think we need to increase our faith and confidence in our public institutions, whether or not you think they should be smaller or larger. And I hope that millennials do see an opportunity to get involved, and obviously that's what we're trying to do.
I think if Madison were here, he would be concerned, and our founding fathers were mostly concerned with centralization of power and accumulation of power, and that power should not be concentrated in any one place. The presidency, Congress, the judiciary, that the division of the power was very important, but also they believed that power was a corrupting influence and that men were liable to be corrupted, that we were imperfect and we would be corrupted by power. And he said, as I said in the beginning, that where the greatest amount of power resides, there lies the greatest danger. And I think that is something maybe not being completely addressed by either candidate, and maybe imperfections on both sides with that. But I think it should be the role of those who want to be involved in civic debate and civic engagement to realize that it's not Republican or Democrat, it's power that is corrupting. We want to disperse power. We want to have most of the power remain with the individual. We only want to give up the power to government that's necessary, and we want to keep that power at a minimum.
Great. Well, thank you both for the evening. It's been wonderful, Senator Paul.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next year at the State of the Constitution. Good night.